There's this painting by Peaches and Cream 02. There's this painting in my great uncle's house, an old painting of a woman, or at least it's a woman now. My uncle lives in a big old historic home in Georgia. It was a plantation at one point, so it's surrounded by fields and only hedged in on one end by a row of scrawny trees that lines the dirt road leading into town. The house itself is beautiful and creaky and warm, all things an old family home should be. The house had been bought by my great-great-grandfather from the original owners, and my family over the many years had worn into the home like one wears in a good pair of boots, till they mold around you. I had grown up in that home, driving to go and visit it on holiday. I knew the house like the back of my hand, and yet, like all good old homes, it was still chock full of mystery. We had spent many a Christmas and Thanksgiving there, many a summer afternoon clomping down the ancient stairs and heading happily for the creek at the edge of the property to find some fairies. My cousins and I were avid believers. I grew up in that home. But I stopped loving it as much when I realized that something was growing up with me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I was 7 when I first noticed it, and let's be honest, I believed in fairies at the time, so I didn't take it too seriously. But then it started getting obvious, like it wanted me to know. It wanted? There's a painting in one of the bedrooms on the top floor. The bedroom is pretty forgotten and never really used, so as vibrant as the rest of the house always was for me, this guest room always seemed faded, even in my memory. The outdated floral bedspread, faded. The yellowing wallpaper, faded. Even the view out of the window seemed fuzzier there than anywhere else. Leaning against the wall, in the corner, there's this painting. I don't know how to describe it. There's a girl in it, a girl about my age. She's standing in front of a bright window while it snows heavily outside. It's hard to see much of the room around her, but its wooden floors seem dusty, and the wallpaper around the girl seems like it's getting tattered around the edges. But the room isn't what changes. It was a day of warm, humid, heavy rain in Georgia when I first noticed. On rainy days visiting my uncle's house, I would spend my time either exploring or watching cartoons. On this particular day, I was wandering around the house as if I hadn't done it a million times before. I was 7 years old. I waltzed, confident and bored, into the spare room and leaned against that faded bed. I looked comfortably around the room and approached the painting leaning against the wall. It was very familiar to me, as was the whole house, but something was different this time. The girl standing in the picture was older. I furrowed my brows to look closer. I could have sworn that she had been a little girl at some point. I even had faint memories of the painting in the spare room being one of a toddler. But now she was definitely older. She was still looking wistfully out of the window at the snow, but more of her face was visible than last time. I could have sworn it. Her hair was the shoulder length of a young girl, her legs were longer, her face a bit slimmer. I tried to reason with myself. I'd been seeing this painting for many years, and I'd always identified myself with the girl in some way. I probably had seen her as a younger girl when I was a younger girl, and now just felt older myself. But I did find it odd that my memories of a painting of a smaller girl were so vivid. I left the room, feeling weird, and brushed the whole thing off. I was making it up. The room had never changed a bit, let alone an old portrait inside of it. That was in the summer. I visited my uncle's house again that Christmas, and I knew something was off. I went into the spare room again, a bit more apprehensive this time. The bedspread was still faded. The wallpaper was still yellowing. The painting was still propped up in the corner. But my eyes widened when I inspected the painting. Her face was turned to the side. I could reason away everything before, in the summer, but I knew for sure that she had been looking out of the window before this. I remember not being able to see the color of her eyes when I was little, which was something I always was curious about. But now I could see them. They were a dark brown. I was 7, so I don't blame myself for turning and hurrying out of the room, shaking off the strangeness of it all, in the way only a 7-year-old could do. But now I'm 18, and something terrifying has happened. Every time I visited my uncle since that summer, I've poked my head nervously into the room to investigate the painting, and every time she's a little different. Slowly but surely, more and more of her face is visible. It's like she's turning her gaze away from the window and towards the front of the painting. She grew much taller. It was easy to tell with the window behind her as a reference. Her hair was longer, her body fuller, her skin more freckled. She was growing with me, and there was no doubt about it. Last summer, at my uncle's house, I peeked in on it again. It was the first time in a couple of years. My heart beat quickly as I reached for the brass doorknob, praying that I had just been imagining things. The door yawned open to reveal the familiar, faded room. I swallowed and turned to see the painting. My heart stopped. She was looking right at me. No longer looking out of the window like she was supposed to, no longer only half facing the window. She was looking unblinkingly right at me. I squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, wondering if I was seeing things. But she met me with her dark eyes. In a frantic clench of my stomach, I jumped back out of the room, slamming the door behind me unintentionally. I backed away from it, terrified. My chest was heaving and I quickly made the sign of the cross over myself. Whatever the hell was going on in that room, I felt that would protect me. I hurried into my room and wrenched my phone from my back pocket. I needed to call my dad, my lifeline. He was abroad on business at the time, so when he picked up, he addressed me with annoyance. I had woken him up. But when he heard my fearful tone, he fell silent to listen. I told him what had happened, what had been going on over the years. He listened, and through the phone I can imagine his knitted brows and narrowed eyes. Being a very religious family, we believe in the supernatural and the power of evil in the world. So his first suggestion was that I call the nearest church. He told me to calm down and think rationally, say a prayer, and get some help. He promised me I would be safe, and promised to keep his phone on at all times just in case. I hung up and grabbed my bag off the hook of the back of the door. I was going to the church. I told my mother I was just going to pray for a while. She tends to worry even more than I do, so I didn't want to scare her with whatever was going on upstairs. I ducked into the car and crunched down the gravel driveway and onto the dirt road that led into town. My left hand was tangled around the rosary in my pocket as I drove. I calmed myself down and told myself that it was probably nothing. My dad would have said so if it was a big deal. When I got to the church, I made a beeline for the offices where I asked to speak to the priest. We had known Father Larry for a long time, so he greeted me happily as he emerged from his small office. I sat with him in his poofy chairs, wringing my hands. I explained to him what had happened. He hummed in response and thought for a little while. He advised me to just let it be for a while and maybe do some research of my own. Asked my uncle where he had got the painting, who had painted it, things like that. Then to check back on it, and if it still seemed wrong, he would come over to bless the thing and the whole room, if need be. I agreed, and he showed me out of his office. I tried to distract myself back at the house until my uncle got back from the grocery store. I sat in my room, reading, when I heard a thump from down the hall. My heart dropped when I realized that it had come from the faded room. Then I heard my little cousin's voice. She was calling me from the room, needing help with something. "I'm coming," I called back, getting out of bed. I didn't want to go back into the room, but as long as I wasn't alone in there. I opened the door and my eyes shot open wide. My little cousin wasn't in there at all. Not able to help it, I glanced over at the painting. I screamed a tiny bit when I saw the girl was standing a few steps further away from the window, now closer to me. I once again jumped back out of the room and slammed the door. I quickly located my little cousin who had been downstairs the whole time. During the next week or two, I tried to ignore the whole thing, but every time I peeked into the room, I was met with a new horror. On the second day, I realized she was holding something behind her back. On the third day, I realized it was rope. On the fourth day, she wasn't a young woman anymore, but closer to middle age. On the fifth day, she was noticeably older. On the sixth day, she had wrinkles and was even closer to the frame. On the seventh day, even closer, even older. It was the eighth day that sent me speeding back to the church. After being haunted by that dark brown gaze for a week, it was suddenly gone. I screamed loudly when I opened the door and saw that blood covered the floor in the painting and was leaking out of the frame. Thick and dark, it dripped onto the faded room's wooden floor in a steady flow. The old woman was gone. I flew down the stairs, ignoring my mother and brother's questions, and sped to the church, not even thinking about being pulled over. I demanded to see the priest and burst into panic tears when Father Larry asked me what was wrong. He hugged me and I tried to catch my breath, wrapping my arms around myself. "It's me. I know it," I sobbed. "She's going to kill me. That's why she grew old so quickly. The rope, she's... I choked. He reasoned what he could out of my gasping and agreed to accompany me back to the house. Once I could breathe, I told him he was welcome to stay for dinner. It would be a good time for the both of us to ask about the origins of the painting. We drove back to the house, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing but dread as the old whitewashed house grew before us in the yellow fields. Father Larry bolstered me up, and we went inside, explaining to my mother that I had invited him for dinner. She welcomed him. My uncle welcomed him too. And everything seemed to be all right, but I felt tears prick at my eyes every time I thought of the stairs, the hallway, the door, the room. During dinner, I turned to my uncle, feeling Father Larry's support from across the table. "So, Uncle Keith, that painting up in the spare room, where did you get it from?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though the thought of the thing made me shiver. He knit his eyebrows and lowered his fork. "What painting?"